So we're continuing our lecture on social learning, and I just wanted to do a couple of review questions before we continue with social norms and conformity. If you're in your car with your friend driving on Main Street in Durham, and she gets pulled over by the police for speeding, now you drive more slowly when you go down that street. How have you learned? Now, you could say broadly that you learned through social learning or observational learning, and that would be a correct answer. But the specifics are that you've decreased your fast driving behavior. So because you've reduced your behavior, that would probably have to be called punishment. And because you reduced your behavior because of watching someone else get punished, we would call that then vicarious punishment. And you should be able to explain the two-action method. If you can't, you should go back and look at the last lecture of what that is and be able to explain how that actually works and how you would test for imitation. But it is a test of observational learning where we would do an analysis of subjects being shown two methods, one method that's reinforced, and then statistically analyze whether or not they use the reinforced method. So I want to talk a little bit now about social norms and conformity. When we learn from others how to fit in to our group, how to act like other group members to avoid conflict. But a social norm is expectations that a particular group has about what behavior or actions or feelings are appropriate within a given group. And conformity is a phenomenon in which the type of social influence involves a change of belief or behavior to fit in with the social norms of a particular group. So I want to talk now about how these kinds of phenomenon evolved, how they were adaptive for non-human primates and for humans. So we need to really examine and be able to collect data about whether animals actually are conforming. And in this case, the way we do this is to what we call seeding. We seed, S-E-E-D, two types of either tool use or two food preference choices, and then see if those preferences perpetuate themselves in the community. So here you can take two groups of monkeys and teach each group a specific way or technique of finding food, and then let that monkey go back into its own group and see whether through social learning the animals in that group adopt the technique that that particular monkey was trained on. So what they saw was that the monkeys in the group did use the technique that was adopted by the founder. We call him a founder monkey. So the founder learns one technique, goes back into his group, and the rest of the group uses the same technique that the founder was taught. And even when the monkeys in the group could discover another way of gaining access to the food, an alternate method, they stuck to the method that the group was using. So they seemed to conform to the way that the founder had done the task. This suggests that there can be a simple and easy to demonstrate effect of social conformity on learned behavioral techniques. And we see this in chimpanzees and even humans on a simple kind of a test would show the same kinds of results. So that was a test on basically tool use or problem solving. The other group of tests we can do are food preferences. So what we do is we seed or plant a food preference by doing something a little sneaky. You can give two choices of food, but make one of those types of foods taste bad by adding some kind of a chemical to it. And then having a founder, one member of the group, be exposed to that food, and then put him back in his group, and then see what the group members then would copy, whether they would use his food choice. And it showed that if you put a mother back in, their new infants would copy the food choice of the mother, even if the second food this time now tastes fine, they stuck with her her avoidance of the bad tasting food type. And we could see this food preference persisting even when individuals started going and coming and leaving and going out of the groups. They would, immigrants coming in would then switch to the new local food preference. And even if they had a preference for one of the the other food type, new monkeys coming in would forego that preference and act like the group was acting. So begin to eat the food and favor the food that the group was favoring. So we can see this social learning being a huge force in how animals in groups act, and we can also see how this can influence things like flavor palettes of particular groups of people, whereas, in Asia they prefer sort of the umami, sort of soy, salty tasting foods, and that becomes sort of the group norm for that region. We also, as humans, conform in many, many ways in groups. The most obvious way is what we wear. So this was a trend for about, a good 10 years at UNH. The costume, if you will, of the dress of the particular group of people in a place and time in a certain context where people would conform quite a bit to this social norm. Now, what stems from this is the study of obedience to authority. We want to act in a way that doesn't disrupt the group dynamic, and so a sort of obedience to authority has evolved. And it's a form of social influence where an individual acts in response to coercion from another, usually more dominant individual. So this happens in a group or society where there's a dominance hierarchy or differences in power or status, and the person or people at the top give orders or give the rules, and then the people at the bottom, or individuals or animals at the bottom, then have to exhibit obedience to this order. The interest in this kind of psychology, why people obey authority, started with World War II and the examination of the behavior of the SS Nazi soldiers who were given horrendous orders to torture and kill people. And they wanted to know why. What is it about the human psychology that makes us want to obey authority? So Milgram conducted a very famous set of experiments on this idea. You may have learned about Milgram in some of your other classes, especially social psychology, but I think it's very important to understand the development of obedience to authority, how this transferred from our ancestors to current humans, and why this is important to understand. So let me show you Milgram's study, and don't forget to take notes. But I'll skip a little bit.
Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. and he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Will you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room, and this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was in the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. There's nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean, as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
Wait a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You got no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know. Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experimenter. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the shock board, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. I want the 180 volts. Please continue, teacher. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one, slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 60-65% of the people went all the way to the top of the shock board.
450 volts. That's it. Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think, very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau. A death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows like how far.
Okay, so you get the idea there. Very well replicated. Also, they've done similar studies and found a proportion of the population would continue, and only a small percentage, maybe about 25%, would leave the room or halt the experiment. So it was a very interesting study in obedience. And it just shows how important obedience and fitting in with the group norms has been, and how how ingrained it is for people, because it's been evolutionarily adaptive for us to behave this way. Now, the outcome for an individual who does not obey authority, someone who goes against the social norms, can be ostracized. This can be the outcome, and it can have some very horrible ramifications to an individual in a group who is relying on the group. So, socially determined exclusion from resources and opportunities necessary for successful reproduction, survival, and passing on of genes. And this is a mechanism by which individuals can maximize their own reproductive success at the expense of others when they ostracize another individual, get them out, exclude them from resources if they're not following the social norms. So how some examples of this are males that would exclude other males simply from opportunities to mate with females. Males can be ostracized if they don't behave the way that they should in the group, can be excluded or not allowed to mate with females. That's a direct relationship to their fitness, to their ability to pass on their genes. Females can be excluded from food or resources that they would need to raise their offspring, resulting in offspring fatality, and again, a direct result for their reproductive and genetic fitness. So sometimes ostracism can be so intense that it would lead to an individual being kicked out of a group and left on their own, basically, to survive without the group. So migration means leaving the group. And what happens to these individuals when they leave the group, so if they don't behave, they don't obey, they don't adhere to social norms, then if they leave the group, if they're forced to leave, they usually, a lot of times, will die on their own, or definitely get sick or have injuries because they don't have the protection of the group. So it's a serious consequence. And it gives the group protection and strength because it can force individuals to comply with certain rules that may be necessary for the safety of the group. So if an individual, like a monkey or a chimp or a person, is acting badly or dangerously for the group, the threat of ostracism can elicit the correction of those behaviors, or it can force an individual to actually leave and go join a new group or try to survive on their own. So it has some serious implications. One of the things that is not allowed in certain groups is excessive violence on either females or on juveniles. So there's a study that looked at what happened to a teenager, a young adult male, who attacked who was attacking females for no reason. So he was basically a bully. And they wanted to look and see what the group response would be to this individual. And so the alpha male would punish this individual and not allow him to continue on with this aggressive behavior. Eventually, the individual was kicked out of the group and not allowed to be part of the group anymore. So what do we know about ostracism in humans? We can ask people, how do they feel when they've been left out of a group or ostracized? And it's actually very, very difficult for us because, as I said, we're so ingrained to feel like we need to be part of the group, to obey the rules and the norms and be obedient in the group, that if we're not, we often just feel terrible. So it actually is equivalent to feeling pain. The regions of brain that respond to pain are actually firing action potentials in result to actual ostracism or simulated ostracism. And if you ask people how they feel terrible. They feel that they don't belong, their self-esteem is low, and have really bad outcomes, which can lead to, anxiety, depression, and some other kinds of clinical issues. So what can happen in the extreme case is if you are ostracized, if you don't fit in, if you're not being accepted by the group, is people can sort of say, well, I'm going to now become provocative. I'm going to act in ways that force people to recognize that, I'm worthwhile. My existence has a purpose. And sometimes we see people who commit violent crimes, atrocities, serial killers, terrorists, those kinds of people, if you ask them about their past history, we'll see that they have been ostracized in the past. It allows them to gain some sort of control, some sense of meaning. So these things are really major, have major implications for studying human behavior, and some of the most upsetting and disturbing aspects of human behavior can be understood in terms of the evolution of these kinds of social norms and obedience and ostracism. And this was a newer study. I just wanted to point out, it won't be on the exam, but it looked at high school students who had a weapon and bullying and ostracism. So it's a pretty scary statistic here, but it says that percentage of high school students carrying a weapon was directly correlated with how much they had been bullied or feeling like they didn't fit into the group. So this is a huge push on studying this kind of thing. Okay, thank you very much. That's all. We'll continue next time.